can't honestly believe a woman who skips Thanksgiving for 9 years gets to walk in here and rewrite my wife's wishes, my stepfather said, and across the table his lawyer gave a small, practiced nod, the kind that's supposed to make a thing sound settled. My stepbrother slid a tissue toward him like grief was something you could perform on cue. I didn't move. I kept my hands flat on the folder in front of me and my eyes on the judge, and I let the sentence hang there in the recycled air of that little county courtroom until it started to smell like exactly what it was. Then the judge looked up over her glasses, not at me, at his attorney, and she asked one quiet question. "Counsel, has your client read the petitioner's professional disclosure?" The lawyer's mouth opened. Nothing came out. And for the first time since we'd all sat down that morning, my stepfather stopped looking comfortable. People expect a lot of things from a courtroom that courtrooms almost never give them. They expect raised voices and a witness breaking down and somebody pointing a shaking finger across the aisle. What they get instead is fluorescent light, a carpet the color of old oatmeal, a clerk who's already thinking about lunch, and a clock on the wall that's loud in the way. Clocks only get loud when nobody wants to be in the room. This was a probate division in a county courthouse about 40 minutes outside Columbus, the kind of building with a metal detector run by a board deputy and a vending machine that only takes exact change. There was nothing dramatic about it. That was the part I'd been counting on. My stepfather sat in a gray sport coat that still had the department store fold lines in the sleeves. He'd dressed to look like a reasonable man who'd been put upon, a widower dragged into something distasteful by a stranger. He was good at that. He'd always been good at looking like the calmest person in any room he just made unbearable. My stepbrother sat next to him in a polo shirt, 31 years old and still arranging his face to match his father's. Their lawyer had a leather portfolio and a fountain pen, and the relaxed posture of a man who'd assumed this was a formality, a tidy little hearing where the out-of-town daughter would get a stern look from the judge and go home. I had a folder, a plain manila folder, the kind you buy in a 100-pack at an office store. My own attorney sat to my right with a legal pad he wasn't writing on, because we'd already decided that the morning would start with me saying as little as humanly possible. He didn't glance at me. He didn't need to. We'd gone over this in his office twice, the way I used to go over a set of bank statements before I knew which line was the lie. The clerk read the case into the record. A petition contesting amendments to a family trust, a dispute over the validity of changes made to that trust in the final 18 months of my mother's life, a question of whether the daughter named in the original document still had standing to challenge what had been done to it after she'd been in there telling. Gone. His attorney stood first, because he thought the law was already in his pocket. Your Honor, this matter concerns lawful revisions to the family trust, executed and notarized while the settler was of sound mind. The petitioner, and here he tipped his head toward me without actually looking, the way you gesture at a piece of furniture you were trying to sell, has had effectively no relationship with the family for the better part of a decade. She did not provide care. She was not present. The amendments simply brought the trust into line with the reality of the household. Reality of the household. I almost admired it. It was a clean phrase, lawyerly, and it carried inside it the whole story they'd been telling each other for years, the one where I was a cold woman who'd chosen a career over her dying mother, and they were the family who'd stayed. My stepfather leaned in to add his own brick to it. She left, he said, soft and sad. She made her choices a long time ago. We respected that. But she can't disappear for years and then come back when there's money on the table. He let that sit. Money on the table. He wanted the judge to picture a vulture. I did not picture a vulture. I pictured my mother in a recliner in a den that used to be hers, with the TV up too loud, on a phone that he put on the highest shelf in the kitchen so she'd have to ask for it. But I didn't say any of that. I'd learned a long time ago that the people who talk first in a room like this are usually the ones who've decided how the story ends, and the fastest way to lose is to argue with their version instead of replacing it. The judge wrote something. She turned a page in the file. She adjusted her glasses, and then she asked the question that took the air out of the room, the one about whether his client had actually read what I did for a living. The lawyer recovered enough to say he'd review it, and the judge said she'd give them the chance to. And she ordered a full evidentiary review of every amendment to the trust and the circumstances under which my name had come off of it. One tap of the gavel, not hard. A 15-minute recess. My stepfather walked past me on his way out and didn't say a word. He didn't think he had to. He still believed he'd said everything that mattered before he ever walked in. He was about to learn how wrong that was. The hallway outside smelled like burnt coffee and the lemon stuff janitors use. There was a wooden bench and a water fountain with a sign that said it was broken. And down the hall, another family was having their own quiet catastrophe in whispers. My lawyer handed me a paper cup of water from the cooler in the clerk's office. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," I said. And I was. He studied me for a second. The way people do when they're trying to figure out if you're as steady as you look. "They just told the judge you've been a stranger for 9 years, he said. Right before we put on the record what those 9 years actually were. He almost smiled. They have no idea what they walked into. I knew that. But it gave me no pleasure. Not the way I'd expected it to when I was younger and used to lie awake building courtroom scenes in my head. Scenes where someone finally admitted what they'd done and I got to watch their face fall apart. Reality doesn't hand you that. What it hands you, if you're patient, is something quieter and much harder to argue with. I should explain the 9 years, because they're going to keep calling it the same thing and I want you to have the real version. My parents split up when I was 7. My father moved to Arizona and then mostly out of the picture, the way some men do, sending a card on the wrong birthday and calling when he needed to feel like a good person for an afternoon. My mother raised me on a dental hygienist salary in a 2-bedroom in a development off Route 23, where every house had the same vinyl siding in a slightly different shade of beige. She was not a dramatic woman. She clipped coupons. She kept a tin in the freezer with $1,100 in it for emergencies and a note rubber banded around it that said "for a real emergencies" only in her tidy block letters. She believed in writing things down. She kept receipts for everything, taped into a spiral notebook by month, because she'd watched her own mother get cheated by a contractor once, and decided that the truth was something you proved, not something you hoped people would honor. She married my stepfather when I was 14. I want to be fair, because being unfair would make this easier, and I don't want it to be easy. The first year was fine. He coached my stepbrother's travel baseball and grilled on weekends and called my mother kiddo in a way she seemed to like. The change came so slowly, I couldn't have put a date on it. It was the kind of thing that only shows up when you add up the months. The notebook with the receipts disappeared from the kitchen drawer. The emergency tin migrated out of the freezer. My mother started checking with him before she answered questions she used to just answer. By the time I was a senior, the house had quietly become a place where her opinion arrived second. I left at 18 on a scholarship and a stubbornness I inherited from her, even if she'd stopped using hers. I went to school in Cincinnati, then Chicago, for the part that took longest. I'd love to tell you it was because I had a calling. The truth is plainer. I was good at numbers, and I was good at noticing when something didn't add up. And somewhere in the middle of an accounting program, a professor pulled a forensic case study out of a folder and walked us through how a man had hidden $2 million from his own business partners, using nothing but timing and tired bookkeepers, and I felt something click into place. People could lie with words all day. Numbers held still. If you laid them out in order, they told you the truth, whether anyone wanted them to or not. I built a career on that. I won't dress it up. I track money that's been hidden, and I testify about how it was hidden, and I am very, very good at reading a paper trail that was designed to be unreadable. The contact didn't stop all at once. It thinned. I'd call and my stepfather would answer and say she was resting. I'd come for a holiday and the visit would somehow get rescheduled to the year. I sent cards she never mentioned receiving. I told myself she was just busy, that the marriage made her happy in a way I didn't understand, that staying away was kinder than forcing my way into a house that had been rearranged, so there was no chair left with my name on it. I told myself a lot of things. Some of them were even true. She got sick about 3.5 years ago. Ovarian cancer, the kind that hides until it doesn't. I found this out the way I found out about most things by then. Sideways, from an aunt on my mother's side who assumed I already knew. By the time I called the house, my stepfather told me it was being handled, that there were good doctors, that the last thing she needed was stress, and that he'd let me know if anything changed. He said the word stress like it was a thing I carried into rooms. For 18 months, she declined. I know now, because I've read the records, that there were stretches. She was lucid and stretches she wasn't. That the medications late in the year left her foggy and sleeping most of the day. I didn't know it then. Every time I called, I got the same wall. Resting. Handled. We'll let you know. I flew in twice. The first time, I sat with her for an hour while my stepfather hovered in the doorway, and she held my hand and asked me twice what city I lived in. The second time, I wasn't allowed past the porch. He said she'd had a hard night and the doctor wanted no visitors, and I stood there in the cold with a grocery bag of the lemon cookies she used to like. And then I drove the rental car back to the airport and cried in the long-term parking lot. She died on a Tuesday in February. I found out on Thursday from the same aunt who said how sorry she was and then said, carefully, that the service had been Wednesday. They'd had the funeral the day after I could have flown in and nobody had called me. I sat with that for a long time. It told me everything about where I stood, more clearly than any document ever could. The trust surfaced about 2 months after that. Not dramatically. A notice forwarded from an old address, then forwarded again. A copy of the amended trust and a cover letter from his attorney informing all interested parties of the estate's administration. My name wasn't crossed out anywhere. That's the part people don't understand. There was no angry red line through me. I simply wasn't there. The original trust my mother set up the year she got remarried named me as a beneficiary. A specific share, the house and trust to pass partly to me. The amended version named my stepfather and my stepbrother and a charity I'd never heard him mention in his life. And where I should have been there was just a smooth, careful absence, like a chair that had been quietly carried out before the guests arrived. I read it 3 times. I want to tell you it gutted me. It didn't, not the way grief had. It felt familiar. It was the same thing the house had done to me for years, just finally written down where I couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. The first call I made wasn't to a lawyer. It was to a colleague, a woman I'd worked a half-dozen cases with, and I asked her something I already knew the answer to. If somebody wanted to know whether a document was actually executed when it says it was, where would you start? She laughed, because she knew I knew. You start with the notary, she said. Notaries keep journals. The journals don't lie, even when the people do. That was the moment I stopped being a daughter who'd been written out of a will and started being the thing I am for a living. I ordered everything. I requested the full medical records, which I had a right to, as a next of kin under the original documents, and which took a polite, persistent month to pry loose. I pulled the county property records on the house. I got the recorded versions of both the original trust and the amendment, with their notarization dates and the notary's commission number stamped on them. And then I did the boring, beautiful work that nobody ever puts in the stories, the work that wins. I laid it all out on a timeline, dates down the left side, documents and medical events across the top. The kind of grid I'd built 100 times for cases that had nothing to do with me. The amendment that erased me was signed and notarized on a Thursday in October, 14 months before she died. The medical records said that on that same Thursday in October, my mother had been admitted to the hospital 2 days earlier, post-surgical, on a morphine drip, with a chart note from the attending physician describing her as intermittently responsive, oriented to person only. She did not know what day it was. She did not, on that Thursday, know where she was. And on that Thursday, a notary had supposedly watched her read and understand and sign a 6-page document restructuring her entire estate. I sat in my apartment in Chicago with the 2 pages side by side, the chart note and the notarization, and I didn't feel triumphant. I felt cold and clear. The way you feel when a case you suspected was rotten turns out to be exactly as rotten as you thought. Because there were only 2 possibilities. Either she'd been wheeled out of an ICU bed to sign away her daughter, which the chart said was impossible, or she'd never signed it at all and somebody had carried it to a notary who hadn't looked too hard. The notary's journal would tell me which. I requested it do my attorney once I'd hired one, and that's where I'll bring him into this, because up to that point, this was just me and a grid and a knot in my chest. When my lawyer asked me, at our first meeting, what I wanted, I think he expected me to say money, or to say I wanted them to pay, or to start crying. People do all 3 in his office. I thought about the question on the drive over, and I gave him the only answer that was true. I want the record fixed, I said. I want the document that erased her wishes thrown out, and I want hers put back. That's all. He set down his pen. Not damages. If the law gives me what was mine, that's enough, I said. I'm not interested in punishing anyone past the truth coming out. The truth coming out is the punishment. Something in the room changed after that. We stopped talking about feelings and started talking about evidence. Capacity. Undue influence. The difference between a will and a will somebody held a pen over. He listened to the whole timeline without interrupting once. And when I finished, he leaned back and said, "I've done this 20 years. People bring me anger. You brought me a forensic accounting." He almost laughed. "We're not going to argue this case. We're going to prove it." In the weeks before the first hearing, I kept my routine. I'm a creature of routine. I think I built that out of the chaos of that house on purpose, brick by brick, until my own days were a place no one could rearrange. I ran in the mornings, I worked my actual cases. And at night, I went through the estate file, the way I went through every file, line by line, marking what was present and what was conspicuously, screamingly absent. Patterns showed up the way they always do if you're willing to be patient. My stepbrother's name appeared as a witness on the amendment. My stepfather's name appeared less than I expected. The charity that received a slice turned out to be a foundation that listed my stepfather's golf buddy as its treasurer. And a notary, when we finally got the commission records, had notarized 11 documents that same week, all of them in the office of the attorney now sitting across from me in court. None of that was illegal by itself. All of it together had a shape. The first hearing was procedural and tense. They argued the same 3 notes: estrangement, absence, choice, and the judge let them. And then she set the evidentiary schedule and recognized me as a party of interest pending review. My stepfather exhaled hard through his nose, the sound of a man who'd expected a layup and gotten a foul called. It wasn't a loss for them. It was worse. It was uncertainty, and uncertainty was the one thing his whole strategy couldn't survive, because his strategy had always depended on no one looking closely. The night before the next filing deadline, my lawyer called me at home. "We got the notary journal," he said. I stood very still by my kitchen window. "And there's an entry for that Thursday in October," he said. "Your mother's name, a signature." He paused, and I could hear him choosing the next part carefully. The signature in the journal doesn't match her signature on anything else in the file. Not the original trust, not her driver's license, not the checks we pulled. And the journal lists the signing as taking place at the attorney's office downtown. He let it land. Your mother was in a hospital bed across the county that day. She didn't drive downtown. She couldn't have walked to the bathroom. I closed my eyes. So somebody signed for her. "Somebody signed for her," he said. "And a notary stamped it. That's not a will contest anymore. That's fraud." I didn't celebrate. I want to be honest about that. Because the stories always have the daughter pumping her fist in the kitchen, and that's not what happened. What happened is I sat down at my table and thought about my mother taping receipts into a notebook so no one could ever say she hadn't paid. And I understood, finally and completely, that she'd spent her whole life trying to make herself impossible to erase. And they'd done it anyway in a single afternoon with a borrowed pen. The grief I hadn't let myself feel at a funeral I wasn't invited to came up all at once, and I let it, alone, where no one could use it. We didn't lead with the notary journal. Timing matters as much in a courtroom as it does in an audit, and you don't show your best number first. You show it when it can't be explained away. So in the hearings that followed, my lawyer just asked questions. Who drafted the amendment? Who chose the notary? Who was present? Who delivered the document to be signed? Each answer fenced them in a little tighter, and each evasion looked worse on the record than an answer would have. Somewhere in there, my stepfather called me. It was the first time he'd reached out directly in years. I let it ring twice before I picked up. "We don't have to keep doing this in front of strangers," he said. "No hello. We can settle it, family to family." I almost laughed at the word family, but laughing would have given him something to hold. "Settle what?" I said. "This misunderstanding," he said. "People are starting to ask questions I don't think any of us want asked." "They should ask them," I said. A long pause. Then, the way a man does when he's run out of script, he said, "What is it you even want?" It was the wrong question, and he didn't know it. "I want the record to be accurate," I said. "I've told everyone that from the start. Nobody seems to believe me, because nobody at your house has ever wanted an accurate record in their life." I heard him breathe. "Your mother wouldn't want this." And there it was, the last card, the one they always play. "Don't," I said. very evenly. You don't get to tell me what she wanted. You signed a paper that pretended to know, and you got the date wrong. The line went quiet, and then it went dead, and I set my phone face down on the table and sat in the dark for a while. Not angry, just certain. The final hearing came on a Monday in spring, the kind of bright, cold morning where the courthouse steps were still slick from overnight rain. I took the same seat I'd taken every time, back straight, feet flat, the manila folder squared on the table. My stepfather sat a full chair away from my stepbrother now. That gap was new. It told me they'd started, somewhere in the last month, to imagine separate exits. His attorney stood first, and you could hear that the confidence had gone out of him. He talked about process and good faith and grief clouding everyone's recollection. He used the word irregularities, the way you'd use a small bandage on something much larger. When he sat, the judge turned to my side. My lawyer called me to the stand. The walk-up felt familiar, because I've made it in a lot of courtrooms, just never my own. I took the oath. He started with the simple things: my name, where I lived, my relationship to my mother. And then he asked the question we built the whole morning around. Will you tell the court what you do for a living? I'm a forensic accountant, I said. I investigate financial fraud. For the last 6 years, I'd worked cases involving falsified documents, estate manipulation, and undue influence. I've testified as an expert witness in federal court. The room did the thing rooms do, not a gasp, nothing theatrical. The clerk's hands paused over her keyboard. His attorney looked down at his portfolio and then up again, recalibrating in real time, because the woman he'd described an hour earlier as an absentee with her hand out had just told the court that reading documents like the one they'd forged was, specifically and professionally, the thing she did better than almost anyone in the building. My stepbrother went the color of paper. My stepfather, for the first time, turned all the way around in his chair to look at me, and I let him, and I didn't look back. My lawyer didn't dwell on it. He didn't need to. He moved straight to the exhibits, and one by one, we walked the court through the grid I'd built in my apartment months earlier. The original trust and its date. The amendment and its date. The hospital admission. The chart note describing my mother as oriented to person only, unable to say what day it was, on a morphine drip. On the same Thursday, a notary swore she'd driven downtown and signed 6 lucid pages. The notary journal entry. The signature that matched nothing she'd ever written. His attorney objected where he could. The judge sustained the small ones and overruled the ones that mattered, and she leaned forward more and more as the timeline assembled itself in front of her, until she wasn't leaning back at all. On cross, his lawyer tried the only road left. You'd been absent for years, he said. Isn't it possible your mother simply changed her mind about you and these documents reflect that? No, I said. You can't know what was in her heart. I'm not testifying about her heart, I said. I'm testifying about her heart, I said. I'm testifying about a calendar. On the day she supposedly signed that document, the hospital says she couldn't tell anyone what year it was. You can change your mind about your daughter. You can't do it from an ICU bed you're not conscious in. It came out steadier than I felt. He sat down. Then the judge asked my stepfather one question, the kind of question that only sounds gentle. Sir, when the amendment was prepared, were you aware of your wife's medical condition that week? He hesitated a beat too long. I don't recall the exact dates, he said. That isn't what I asked, the judge said, and she waited. It was my stepbrother who cracked, not him. He half rose and said, fast, I just signed where they told me to. Dad handled the lawyer. I didn't, and his father put a hand on his arm too late, the way you grab for something already off the table. The judge let the silence do its work, the same silence they'd tried to bury me in for years, and then she closed the file. The court finds, she said, that the amendment dated that October was executed under circumstances that make the settlor's capacity, and indeed her participation, impossible to credit. The signature is inconsistent with the settlor's hand. The notarization is irreconcilable with her documented location and condition. The amendment is void. She looked at me, not unkindly. The original trust is reinstated in full. The petitioner's interest is restored as the settlor intended it, and the court will be referring the circumstances of this notarization to the appropriate authorities for review. One tap of the gavel. she added, almost as an aside. The only thing she said that morning that wasn't strictly procedure, Mr. Clerk. Let the record show this woman was not absent from her mother's life. She was kept from it. There's a difference, and this court intends to honor it. That was all. No but Coffert's room, no but leaping into anyone's shoulder. Just the truth finally laid down somewhere it could no longer be picked back up and rearranged. My stepfather stayed seated as the room emptied around him, smaller than he'd been when he walked in. My stepbrother left first, fast, not looking at anyone. I gathered my plain folder, stepped down past the table, and walked out into a hallway that smelled like burnt coffee and lemon cleaner, and I felt the weight I'd been carrying since that February Tuesday shift not disappear, just settle into something I could finally put down. The paperwork after that took months, the way it always does, the part no one tells stories about. Signatures and certified copies and quiet corrections made in offices that never ask why. I took exactly what the original trust had given me and not $1 more. Even when my lawyer pointed out I could have pushed harder. I didn't want to win the way they tried to win. I wanted to win the way my mother kept her receipts, cleanly, in order, with nothing to be ashamed of. My stepfather called me a few weeks after it closed. I almost let it go to voicemail. I didn't know it had gotten that far, he said. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was the closest thing he had in him. I told him I knew. There was a long pause, and then he said, "You didn't have to take it all the way to court." And I said, "I took it exactly as far as the why went, and not an inch further." And that was the last real thing either of us said to each other. With my share, I did 2 things. I set up a small scholarship in my mother's name at the community college where she'd taken night classes she never told anyone about. For women going back to school later than they'd planned, the ones with notebooks full of receipts and a tin in the freezer. And I made a donation to a legal aid clinic that helps people contest exactly the kind of quiet theft that almost worked on me. The ones who don't happen to read documents for a living and can't afford someone who does. There was no ceremony, just a record, which is the only monument my mother ever really trusted. I keep her notebook now, the one with the receipts taped in by month. I found it in a box of her things my aunt mailed me, the one box that made it out of that house. I don't open it for the receipts. I open it because her handwriting is on every page, those tidy block letters, proof in her own hand that she was here, that she paid her own way, that she counted. They thought a person could be carried out of a story as easily as a chair out of a room, as long as you did it politely and got the right stamp on it. They were wrong about her, and they were wrong about me, and the difference between us in the end was only this. She believed the truth would protect her, and I made sure it actually did. If you've ever watched someone you love get edited out of their own life, one quiet rearrangement at a time, and been told you were the one who left, I want you to hear me. You don't have to raise your voice to be believed. You don't have to rain anything down to be made whole. You just have to refuse to disappear and keep the receipts and wait for the day someone finally has to answer for the dates. The loud ones think silence means surrender. It almost never does. Sometimes it just means somebody is reading very carefully and writing it all down and waiting for the room to get quiet enough to be heard. What stays with me isn't the gavel or the judge's voice. It's that Thursday in October sitting on a hospital chart next to a notary stamp. 2 pieces of paper that could not both be telling the truth. The whole thing came apart on a single date, and that's the part I keep turning over. My stepfather didn't lose because I was angrier than him or louder than him. He lost because a lie can only hold its shape until somebody checks it against a calendar, and no amount of confidence at that table could move my mother out of an ICU bed she was sedated in. Cause and effect. He built his story on the hope that nobody would look closely, and the day someone did, it collapsed under its own weight. I think about my mother taping receipts into that notebook, month after month, and her tidy block letters, and I understand now what she was really teaching me. She wasn't being cheap or paranoid. She was showing me that the truth isn't something you feel, it's something you can prove, and that the people who try to rewrite you are betting you'll be too hurt or too tired to do the proving. Roy and Travis bet exactly that. They were wrong, and being wrong cost them everything they tried to steal. If you take anything from what happened to me, take this. The first thing that saved me was refusing to cut a corner I was furious enough to cut. I could have lied a little to win faster. I did it because the whole point was that one of us still cared whether the record was honest, and it had to be me. The second thing was learning to slow down and read the pattern instead of reacting to the insult. Anybody can shout back. It takes something harder to lay the dates in a row and let them speak. And the third thing, the one that took the longest to build, was the plain stubbornness to keep showing up to a fight that was designed to make me quit. 9 years of being told I'd left. 2 months of pulling records. Months more of paperwork after the verdict. None of it was dramatic. All of it was necessary. So if you've ever been edited out of your own life by someone polite enough to do it quietly, don't waste your strength on rage. Stay honest when they expect you to stoop. Get clear-eyed about what actually happened and write it down. And then outlast them, because the people who erase you are counting on you to disappear. And the most powerful thing you can do is simply still be standing with the proof in your hand when the room finally goes quiet enough to hear it.